Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. Later in the show, House Minority Leader Josh Boschee, a state representative from District 44 in Fargo, is going to be joining me to talk a little bit about where we are at this point in the legislative session, some of his perspectives on the way things are working, and obviously we're coming in towards the end of the session where some important questions about the budget are going to be answered. You'll hear all of that a little bit later in the show. Also, I talked to them a little bit about, this is his first legislative session as a leader of his caucus. And I've noticed that this session has been a lot less partisan, perhaps, than legislative sessions in the past. And he agreed. And so it's an interesting discussion. Stay tuned for that. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about victimhood. Now, last week, in fact, late last week, very late on Friday evening, there was a story that broke about State Representative Ruth Buffalo supposedly facing threats. Reporter Kim Hyatt for the Fargo Forum wrote in her article, I quote, "Although leery for her safety after receiving threats this week for showing support for U.S. Representative Ilhan Omar, North Dakota Representative Ruth Buffalo said she's continuing her work on policies rather than focusing on polarization." Now, I read that article, and obviously I was very concerned about the threats, although what interested me is that the Forum article written by Kim Hyatt didn't have anything specific about the threats that were made to Representative Buffalo. So Friday night, I made a request to the North Dakota Highway Patrol, and I also checked, by the way, with the Fargo Police Department, who would be the jurisdiction for where Representative Buffalo lives. I wasn't sure where she would have made a report. The Fargo Police Department didn't have anything, but the North Dakota Highway Patrol, which handles security for the state capitol, and I know in the past when people have made questionable or perhaps aggressive comments towards lawmakers, they've investigated it. I contacted the North Dakota Highway Patrol, and they provided me with a report, and the report detailed a situation where a woman in Minot, her name is Tor Maris Lindemann. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. You may recognize her. She's made headlines for an event she tried to stage here in the city of Minot, which got her investigated by the Attorney General's office, and she's been in sort of a running legal dispute with the state Attorney General's office. A situation in which she is, by the way, represented by former Democratic Attorney General David Thompson. But anyway, it turns out that the whole thing, there weren't threats. At least there was only one threat that was reported to, or serious enough for Representative Buffalo to have reported to the North Dakota Highway Patrol. The one threat that was reported was this comment by Tor Maris Lindemann posted to Ruth Buffalo's, posted about Ruth Buffalo on another media outlet's Facebook page. And this is what Maris Lindemann wrote. I quote, "I think Ruth Anna Buffalo needs to be investigated. She cannot go around advocating for a woman we've discovered committed immigration fraud. She may be Native American, but the Native American children go missing all the time. I hope Ruth knows that is my forte, because one thing I've realized is that everyone has a price." So that's a little weird, right? And I can understand how somebody reading that comment might be concerned. So Ruth Buffalo reported it to the North Dakota Highway Patrol. The North Dakota Highway Patrol investigated it. You can read the full report if you want to at sayanythingblog.com. They sent a patrol officer to Lindemann's home in Minot. They interviewed her. She basically said she considers herself to be something of an investigative journalist. I guess she's got some website or something. I'm not sure. But she considers herself an investigative journalist. She says she investigates, missing children on the reservation, and her comment, muddled as it was an allusion to that. The officer came away saying, I quote, "When interviewing Maris Lindemann, I didn't feel that there was a legitimate threat towards Representative Buffalo or her family. I concluded the interview and left Maris Lindemann's residence at approximately 14:01 hours." So essentially we had a Facebook comment. Representative Buffalo reported that to the North Dakota Highway Patrol. The North Dakota Highway Patrol investigated it. They found no legitimate threat. I don't have a problem with any of that. I can understand, as somebody who, by the way, gets no small amount of hate online. I have people directing questionable comments to me just about every day. I get it. And I can understand why Representative Buffalo might have wanted to report this. What I don't understand is the resulting, statement giving to the Fargo Forum by the North Dakota Human Rights Coalition, and Representative Buffalo, sort of grandstanding in this article to the Fargo Forum. And by the way, the Fargo Forum report not including anything specific about the threat at all, because again, while the Facebook comment in question was certainly dubious, it's questionable, no doubt. I guess I don't understand why there was such a big deal, except that maybe I do. You see, in modern politics, victimhood has a sort of currency, right? If you can claim to be a victim, that gives you clout. We've decided that collectively in politics. We use this all the time. Always trying to imbue a particular, imbue a particular. I mixed up there. I mixed up the words imbue and infuse. I think I said imbues. We try to imbue an issue, infuse an issue with the moral high ground, right? We try to claim the moral high ground, and you can do that by saying, well, listen, I'm a victim, right? And sometimes that's okay, right? Because if we're talking about human trafficking and you're somebody who is human trafficked, then yes, you have a lived experience that is valuable to that debate. No question about it. But sometimes I feel like people try to get a hold of some of the currency of victimhood when maybe they're not entitled for it. Now, I don't think the situation with Representative Buffalo is comparable, because I don't think there's any hint that she committed any sort of fraud or made anything up. She may have exaggerated the situation a little bit. She may have, I don't even want to say she exaggerated to it. I think she may have grandstanded a little bit around the issue, but she didn't make anything up. But Jussie Smollett made something up, right? In that situation in Chicago where he claims that he was, the victim of a hate crime. He's now facing, charges, multiple felonies. It sure looks, now he's innocent until proven guilty. He'll have his day in court, but it sure looks right now to somebody on the outside looking in like he made that whole thing up. And certainly there are others who are saying that in fact that he paid them to perpetrate a fake hate crime on him so that he could turn around and generate headlines. Jussie Smollett was doing that because he wanted that currency of being a victim, right? He's an actor. He's an entertainer. He wanted that. He thought that it probably, I'm guessing here, but I'm assuming his motivation was wanting something to boost his career. He's an openly gay African-American actor, and he wanted to be a victim too, because if he was a victim, that would help his career. I think that's what happened with Jussie Smollett. I think Representative Buffalo, in reporting this, I think ran to the media and decided that this would be something that could give her some political capital. If she was a victim, it would give her some political capital. And the thing about this is it's gotten so carried away that there's actually a hierarchy, an aristocracy, if you will, to quote a recent Jonah Goldberg column, an aristocracy, to victimhood, where there's like different levels of it. And we saw it play out actually around the Ilhan Omar controversy, right? Because Representative Omar has made comments that I think reasonable people agree are pretty questionable about Jews. When she's out making comments about how, Jewish people should, her situation, the Jewish people like control the world. I mean, these are very classic anti-Semitic tropes. And she's out there as elected member of the United States Congress perpetrating them. And that's problematic. There's a lot of people who are understandably upset about that. And yet when Democrats move to pass a resolution condemning those specific comments, they had to water it down. They had to try to protect Representative Omar, because the problem is the aristocracy of victimhood. You see, Representative Omar herself had a tough childhood. She was a refugee from Somalia who came to the United States. She's a Muslim woman. She's an African-American woman. I don't need to explain to you all the fraught politics that surround those identities. I mean, it's absolutely the truth. Muslims have at times been mistreated in the United States. African Americans have at times been mistreated in the United States. There's no question about that. So the problem is that Ilhan Omar is using her own victimhood as a way to defend her bigotry towards another historically victimized group, the Jews. It creates a problem. This is where the aristocracy, I think on the left they actually call it intersectionalism, right? I mean, it's really sort of a group where different victim groups have different levels of grievances, right? So Jews are doing pretty good today. In fact, Jews have always done pretty good. They're an industrious people. They've always highly valued work and entrepreneurship and education, and as a result, they've done well for themselves. And so I think there's a feeling out there that because Jews are as a people, generally pretty affluent, that maybe their victimhood, even though we're just a generation or two removed away from millions of them being slaughtered wholesale in Europe, there's a feeling that their victimhood is now somehow lesser, right? And you could actually hear some of the Democrats who were defending Ilhan Omar. In fact, I think it was I want to say it was Representative Jim Clyburn. I don't have the direct comments, but it was a member of the Democratic Black Caucus who was, explaining that like her lived experience was more recent and it was more visceral, and so it's different from maybe somebody who was just the descendant of a Holocaust survivor, right? So if you're a Jew today and you didn't actually live through the Holocaust, then you have less of a right to be offended by what Representative Omar said because she lived through her refugee, travels from Somalia into the United States. She has a lived experience. You maybe just merely have a historical experience. Therefore, her victimhood is fresher than yours. And I guess she's justified then in saying hateful things about Jews. Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me either, but yet this is where we are, where we've said that victimhood has a currency to it, right? Victimhood gives you power in politics, and how much power it gives you, well, that's how it's sort of a ranking system. Now, I don't want to be dismissive of victimhood, but being a victim does not necessarily make you right about anything. And, to follow that thread of thought, not being a victim doesn't necessarily make you wrong. Now, again, people who have lived through awful things have lived experiences that are valuable, right? I mean, I think that we put a lot of stock in somebody who is speaking out against socialism and communism if they lived under Stalin, right? I mean, I think most of us would say, okay, well, they understand. They have something to say that maybe we should all listen to because they lived through it. Whereas maybe the rest of us just sort of read about it or watched a documentary about it. I mean, the rest of us learned from history. They lived the history. That's important. But it's not a shield. It's not some force field. And I think in politics, it's become that. In politics, it's become that. You almost, I don't want to say you have to be a victim to be able to speak out on something, but it happens so frequently. It's become such a rote part of American politics that before somebody takes a stand on an issue, they need to explain why they're justified to speak on that issue. Really, it's all got its roots in identity politics, right? Who you are, it's what you have to say, what you believe, what you're arguing, your points that you want to make are all filtered through who you are. And so if your skin's a certain color, or you have a certain sexual orientation, or maybe you're a member of a cultural group or whatever, then suddenly your words can go up or down in value based on that. And is that right? Is that how we want things? I'm not sure it is. I'm especially not so sure it is when we've gotten to a point where people fake hate crimes or maybe just exaggerate some of the criticism that they get. And again, I think Representative Buffalo didn't fake anything. I don't think she made anything up, but I certainly think she maybe tried to grandstand on it a little bit. And I think when politicians are doing that, or an actor like Jussie Smollett is doing what it sure appears like he did in Chicago, then I think we run into a situation where we've got to say, listen, maybe we've taken this too far. If people have to contrive their victimhood, that people have to exaggerate it, if they have to embellish it, if they build it up like they're padding a resume, then maybe we've taken it too far. And maybe ideas should just stand on their own 2 feet, and the idea of the person, the identity of the person making the argument or expressing the idea shouldn't matter that much. That's it for today's rant. State Representative Josh Boschee up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, Energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. I am here with State Representative Josh Boschee, who is also the minority leader for the Democratic Caucus in the North Dakota House of Representatives. Josh, how are you?
Great. Good to be with you, Rob.
Now, I wanted to have you on and talk just a little bit. We're obviously, we're past the halfway point of the legislative session, but we're coming down to the nitty-gritty, where most of the votes taken on the floor now are going to end some of these bills, and we're also got some final decisions to make about budgeting. Obviously, the new forecasts for the coming biennium are coming out this week. We'll have two forecasts out early this week. And just tell me, I mean, as one of the legislative leaders for the Democrats in Bismarck, how's it going for you guys so far? How are you feeling about this session, the way it's shaping up?
It's been a pretty good session, I think, all around. There's a great vibe in terms of both parties and both chambers working together. But as far as the Democrats specifically, we're happy with some of the things we've been getting accomplished. And, a number of our ideas have been introduced, and some have made it to the next chamber, and many others haven't, but at least introducing different conversations. We're really looking forward to this budget forecast coming out, and hopefully, so a little bit of an uptick in activity as it relates to oil, so that we can make sure that we're funding some of the priorities we've been looking at.
What sort of priorities? I mean, well, first of all, tell us, I mean, how big of an uptick? I mean, what's a meaningful upward? Because I think most people are thinking we're probably going to get an upwards revision from what we got from the previous forecast. But I mean, to you, what's a meaningful, positive change look like?
Yeah, I think, right now we're basing the budget off of oil being with North Dakota discount at 42.5 cents per barrel. I'm thinking we're going to end up landing somewhere between $45 and $46 after this forecast, based on some of the information I've been seeing. So, certainly would be happy with that, because, a lot of that money doesn't go into the general fund. That's what fills up our extra buckets that we fund some of these one-time projects and other ongoing expenses such as roads and infrastructure projects. So when we see the uptick of oil, that fills a lot of those buckets. That's going to help us with some of those projects. We're looking at statewide, whether it's water, whether it's bridges, whether it's county roads. A lot of those things that the general budget isn't able to provide for at this time.
Sure.
So yeah, $45, $46 we'd be happy with. But the other factor is, we're seeing production dramatically increase. And we're anticipating, I think, about 1.4 billion barrels per day as an average through the next biennium, which is pretty phenomenal when you think about where we started 10 years ago with how much oil we're producing.
Yeah, for sure. It's good news. And you're right. I mean, a lot of the direct oil tax revenues doesn't flow into the general fund. In fact, what's the cap at these days? Is it like $500 million a biennium? I'm forgetting now. For oil tax revenues into the general fund.
Traditionally we're at 300. I think we're sitting at 400 or 500 for this budget.
Yeah, we raised it. I know we raised it. I'm forgetting what we raised it to. It was 300. You're right. But basically, there's a cap on the amount of direct oil tax revenue. But as you say, if we start seeing oil prices go higher, and we have a forecast that they're going to be higher, then I think we can expect more activity, and that activity is going to drive other sorts of revenue that do go into the general fund. Most notably, probably the sales tax. So if we have more oil workers out there, we have more businesses, engaging, and they're out there and they're working and everything's busy, which I think is what we all want. That's going to drive more sales tax revenue. I mean, that's always been hard to pin down, but we know that that's going to be the effect. So we're all hoping there's a little more revenue. Maybe some of these budget choices aren't going to be so hard.
Exactly, and especially since, like I said, both chambers, both parties are in agreement of, we need to get our public employees some salary increases. We need to increase our reimbursement to long-term care and developmentally disabled service providers, and making sure that we get that per pupil payment for K-12 education back up. The biggest disagreement between the chambers and the parties right now is what percentage that lies at. And so, as Democrats, we're advocating that after 4 years of cuts and not getting raises, we want to see that number get to 3 and 3 across the board. But we're not too far off with where we're at with this budget currently.
No, I mean, everybody agrees that they want those to go up. I think it's just a question of how much. And like you said, you guys are at 3-3 for the coming cycle. Now, we have a lot of fighting going on about the legacy fund and how to spend some of those earnings. I know Governor Burgum in his executive budget had various proposals. The Teddy Roosevelt, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because your colleague, Senator Tim Mathern from Fargo, a part of the Democratic Caucus, he proposed a compromise on the Teddy Roosevelt Library that would sort of tie the raises for state employees to the funding for the library. I thought that was a little odd. I thought that was an odd coupling, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I just hadn't really seen that sort of a mashup before, and maybe I'm missing the boat. But tell me a little bit about that proposal. How far do you think that's going to go?
Yeah, in my discussions with Tim and some other folks on appropriations, I think people expect that there'll be some sort of level of funding allocated to the Teddy Roosevelt Library and a couple of the other priorities that the governor has put out there. So what my understanding from Tim is he's just trying to say, let's make sure we fund our needs first, and then we can get to our wants if there's extra cash as it looks at the end of the biennium. And so I think he's just trying to position himself and potentially others that want to support the library down the road to make sure that if we're supporting it, we're also saying that, we have other needs that need to get funded first.
Complicating a lot of this, because obviously we have the new forecast coming out, but we also have the issue with the state funds and what I guess what some are saying is a misallocation or a mistake that was made in allocating some of the oil tax revenues, particularly specifically those collected on tribal lands, allocating them to the various state buckets, Common Schools Trust Fund, et cetera, et cetera. And again, for listeners, this is really complicated, but essentially North Dakota gets a steady stream of revenue from oil taxes. That money flows into what everyone sort of colloquially calls buckets. One bucket being the Legacy Fund, Common Schools Trust Fund. There's a formula and there's an order and how that's all done, and it's kind of opaque, it's kind of complicated. But what some are saying, and I actually had Jody Smith, head of the North Dakota Land Department, who oversees some of these funds. I had her on talking about it, and she was saying that the mistake in the way some of this appropriated, might be as large as $100 million, which, given how closely we've been budgeting everything, Josh, having to suddenly find, if that's the path the legislature decides to go, having to find $100 million to make those back up is going to be a headache. How are you feeling about it? Because everybody I talk to kind of seems to be all over the map. I'm hearing people saying we absolutely have to pay it back. I've had lawmakers tell me we don't have to pay any of that back. We should just fix it going forward. I've even heard some wild speculations all over the map on how much money the mistake even represented. So from your perspective, what's the outcome on that? That seems like a pretty big area of uncertainty that's got to be fixed before a lot of these budgets can be finalized.
Yeah, and that's going to be a big part of the discussion this week with the Senate Finance and Tax Committee hearing what the Republicans are putting forward in terms of their idea for the fix. And, we partially agree with them that let's fix it going forward. The Treasurer Kelly Schmidt is depending on an email she received from an Assistant Attorney General that was trying to clarify what many of us say would be ambiguous language. And to break it down for your listeners, essentially, the ambiguous language is people are thinking that, well, because it was activity that happened on the reservation, that we would have a different distribution of those funds. And I think most of us as common people, when we look at that and say, well, wait a minute, we don't determine, different geographic areas throughout the state for other collection of revenues or deposits into different accounts. Why would we default to let's do it different versus let's do it the same?
Right.
So we're, as the Democrats, we say, yep, let's fix it going forward. But let's also find that money and get it back into the Common Schools Trust Fund, Foundation Aid Stabilization Fund, and the Water Resources Trust Fund. We're looking at, with all three of those buckets, I know Jody's talking about the $100 million plus, and she's looking at the constitutional funds her agency is responsible for, but we're seeing right now it's about $240 million for all three of those buckets. Sure, that's a big pill to swallow, but I think there are resources we have, whether it's the SIF fund or legacy fund interest down the road to pay it back over time. And I think that's right one time SIF, which, The governor's office is telling us that the money will be there at the end of the 1921 biennium, or do we look at legacy fund interest and maybe pay it off over 5 bienniums, depending on how production goes.
When I had Jody Smith on, that was something that she was talking about, was paying it back over time. I mean, at this point, and I realize, speaking both for yourself and your caucus, what's your preference? Pay it back right away or pay it back over time?
Well, initially, I think we're looking at trying to pay it back all at once. The power of compounding interest, especially in the Common Schools Trust Fund, which we depend on per pupil payment, but also the Water Resources Trust Fund. There is money sitting there that, we're saying we don't have enough for all the water projects throughout the state. That'd be in advance of another $120 million that we could put towards, getting some of that final money up to Minot, the diversion program in Fargo, and many other sewer and water projects throughout the state.
What we've been talking a lot about the budget, and obviously I always think there's two types of bills. There's budget bills, and then there's issue bills. What issue bills are lingering out there that are on your radar for the second half?
Well, I think a lot of conversation is going to, again, I think it's this week we'll be hearing at the Senate Finance and Tax Committee is Representative Hedlund's proposal to use legacy fund earnings to buy down our income taxes throughout the state. That I think is going to be interesting because that's a big appropriation and I think one of the big potential ongoing fundings of the legacy fund earnings. And so it'll be interesting to see what the Senate, what I'm hearing is the Senate's not going to be supportive of that. But, as as an ardent observer, nothing's done till it's done, till we leave from Bismarck.
I remember last session, everybody thought after repeal of the blue laws passed in the House that it was going to sail through the Senate, and we all got wet on that one. So you're right. The outcomes can be a little unpredictable.
Yeah, and we're that's another conversation. The Senate will be on the blue law repeal in the next week or so. We're seeing, thankfully Senator Diane Larson, chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, is open to amending some legislation to get some decriminalization happening for small amounts of marijuana. So some of those conversations we think were dead in the House are now over in the Senate and finding their way onto amendments, and we'll keep working to the very end on a number of those ideas with many of our Republican colleagues.
That'll be interesting, particularly the decriminalization bill. I think there's a lot of a bad taste left in a lot of people's mouths after the way that ended. And I don't want to say that anybody did anything on purpose, but it was right at the end. I think particularly right at the end, right before the crossover break. I think that's always a tough part. Maybe tempers are a little short, or everybody's tired, or what have you. But I'm glad to see that issue coming back because I do think it's important.
Right, especially as we look at many of these reforms, we're looking at not just in the criminal justice, but mental and behavioral health. If we can help people, keep their jobs and stay in their apartments, that plays a huge role in making sure that people are able to continue to earn an income. And hopefully if they're misusing or abusing low-level amounts of drugs, especially marijuana, that they can get help with that. But also if they're an infrequent user who gets caught once with a 1E in their pocket, that's not going to ruin their ability to continue being an accountant at a CPA firm.
How do you feel talking about criminal justice reform? I don't know if you've read my Sunday column today, but I argue that this fight over the Dakota Women's Prison or Dakota Women's Correctional, I'm forgetting the acronym for it, but the women's prison in New England, North Dakota, there's been a political spat over it. And obviously I think there's some parochialism going on where some of the people who live in that area don't want to lose a state facility and maybe some of the jobs it brings. The argument coming from the Burgum administration, and in particular Leanne Birch from the Department of Corrections, is that, Leanne Birch has flat out said on this podcast that, she feels some of the Eighth Amendment rights of prisoners are being violated. I mean, she's very stark in her criticism of that facility. But what I'm starting to see now is, we had then a subsequent report where, some information came out about the state penitentiary, and now we have some law enforcement leaders speaking out, notably Chief David Todd from Fargo speaking out about, against some of the criminal justice reforms we've put in place. I've generally been supportive of these things. And I have a feeling just from watching your comments and your votes and things, Josh, that you and I probably largely agree on this area of public policy. I'm a little worried that this fight over the Dakota Women's Prison in New England is going to turn into sort of a backlash against some of the criminal justice reform we've seen across the state. Are you seeing that, or am I being an alarmist?
No, I'm not feeling that inside the chambers, that there's ripple effects of the conversation. I think a lot of legislators like the idea, but the fact that it was dropped on, that it was proposed to us in the middle of December, and we have 80 days to figure this out, the logistics, the cost savings, and things like that, kind of threw us off. So there's certainly a strong appetite to not just study this potential scenario that the governor has put out there, but what do we look like throughout the entire state? Are there opportunities to do more in terms of transitioning different populations throughout the state from an, I know the argument you've been making is this shouldn't be about economic development. This should be about, the rights of people in the prison population,
right,
and how we serve them well. But I think there's a reality of, we look at, are there ways that we can spread that population out and support communities throughout the state, especially when many of the concerns that Leanne has brought up have to do with access to healthcare, access to behavioral health. So are there more resources throughout the state that we can be providing people, not only in the criminal justice system, but the behavioral health system, so that we're meeting needs in the different quadrants of the state, not just putting people in Jamestown, Bismarck, or New England. So I think there's definitely an appetite in terms of studying this to see what can we do to be more holistic, because I think there's a lot of support for Leanne and her vision of rehabilitation, that it's not about we just lock people up and throw away the key, but how do we rehabilitate them, because they're going to be our neighbors more likely than not.
That's the
how
point.
do we make sure that they can?
That's the point I keep making over and over again. Most of these prisoners, the vast majority of them they're going to be out one day, and they're going to be back in your community. And what you want, somebody who has gone through, several years or a few years or whatever their sentence is of, hey, let's get you educated. Let's get some of your addiction issues. Let's take good care of you health-wise and put you out ready to become a productive member of society. That's what we all want. I mean, I don't want them to come out and commit more crimes, but are we really creating a situation where they're going to do that? But that's probably a topic for a whole other podcast. I wanted to wrap up asking you, this is your first session as the leader of your caucus, not your first session obviously as a lawmaker, but the first session in the position of House Minority Leader. How's it going? How's that transition been?
I think it's good. It's certainly, I think, helpful that my colleague, Chet Pollard, this is also his first session as majority leader, so we're learning as we go together. One of us doesn't necessarily have the upper hand on the other in terms of process and how things are working, but we're working well together. And we spend a lot of time throughout the week talking about not only the policy proposals we're trying to advance, but also how can we work together, knowing that, whether it's the left wing of my caucus or the far right wing of his caucus, there's opportunities to create some ruling majorities on some important issues. And how can we work together to get that done?
I think it's really interesting that you say that, because I will say that as an observer and as somebody who's been observing legislative sessions for a while now, this session feels a little less partisan than previous sessions. And I don't know if that's because of some of the personalities who were leaders in past sessions. I don't know specifically what to attribute it to, but there does seem to be less, sort of partisan or political. It's all political, but you know what I understand. Some of the tomfoolery we saw, and as a matter of fact, and I meant to write something about it, and I'm remiss, but your counterpart in the Senate chamber, Senator Heckman, I thought should have been commended, and in fact, I think I'm still going to write something about it, for chastising her own party, for sending out a press release that over what we were discussing earlier in the podcast about Treasurer Schmidt's, whether or not there was a mistake there. I think your party sent out a press release that called her sloppy or whatever, and Senator Heckman said, that wasn't an appropriate way to talk about her. Even that I thought was good, and I don't bring that up to say that Democrats have a monopoly on being jerks any more than Republicans do. I think we definitely all have our moments in this business. But I just it seems a little more professional. It seems a little more adult this session. That's just my perception, just as an observer from the outside looking in. It looks like a little less tempestuous than in the past.
Yep, I would agree. And, when I check in with other legislators from both parties or even the lobbyists who engage with us every day, many of us get that feeling. And I really think that comes from there's a lot of trust going on, especially between the leaders of the two chambers and the two parties, and then again with the governor's office in terms of, there was one situation that came up, I remember, where it felt like some shenanigans were being pulled, and within an hour and a half, there had been several conversations amongst different leaders, and the shenanigans were done with. Because a lot of it was about, we sit down and we had a conversation. This is what we agreed to. Let's move forward based on that.
What are the shenanigans? So you can't bring up shenanigans on the podcast without giving me details, Josh.
Well, sure. Well, I go back to, we have this historic compact with MHA Nation for oil and tax revenues. And there was discussions going on in terms of some amendments. And no one really knew if the amendments were, first the tribe wanted some more, or if the amendments from the Senate, Finance and Tax Committee, on a couple different things. So, we were able to sit down and say, hey, we agreed to this. There was a 1.5-year study that was done on this. Let's advance this topic and study it for the next 1.5 years so that everyone can be on the same page going forward. And like I said, within an 1.5 hours, that was all resolved, and we were on to the next issue. So it is very professional. I think there's a lot of trust. We'll see that as we advance for the next potentially 20 to 30 days.
We're coming up on the hardest part, too. So
there
exactly.
Is that. So, there's going to be emotions. There's going to be, some sparring. But again, I think that's going to come from the policy and less about the personality. That's my hope.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it is nice. And I never have a problem when somebody's passionate about a policy. I mean, I'm passionate about this stuff. We all care about this stuff. It's the law. It matters. It impacts people's lives. We should be passionate about it. And I can understand if somebody gets heated because they care. I just sometimes some of the gamesmanship I think is a little gets annoying. But anyway, Josh, I appreciate your time and good luck on the rest of the session.
Thanks, Rob. We'll talk soon.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Remember, new episodes come out Monday through Friday. If you have any feedback on the show, you can email rob@sayanythingblog.com. If you're listening to this show by streaming it on sayanythingblog.com or maybe inforum.com or the grandforksherald.com, someplace like that through a web browser, remember you can subscribe to the podcast. There's all sorts of services out there: Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes for your desktop. Apple has built-in podcasts. Google has various. There's all sorts of different apps and platforms out there. You can search for Plain Talk with Rob Port on these platforms and find it, subscribe it, and then you can have the audio delivered directly to your device. So you can listen in your car, you can listen when you're on the treadmill, whenever you want to. If you're having trouble finding Plain Talk on any of these platforms, again, email rob@sayanythingblog.com. You can use that email address as well for feedback on the show. If you have questions for our weekly guests, Senator Kevin Cramer, Congressman Kelly Armstrong, send those in that way as well. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.